Hello again from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. I still continue my video series on selected events of certain years, and now it is the time for 1984. Just a moment. (1984) was a leap year, or 366-day year in the Gregorian calendar. On January the 1st, 1984, Brunei, a wealthy, very wealthy country in Southeastern Asia, became a completely independent state. On January the 7th, Brunei became the sixth member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which now has 10 member states. On January the 10th, the United States and the Vatican, or Holy See, restored full diplomatic relations. On January the 22nd, the broadcaster of the Los Angeles Raiders versus Washington Redskins Super Bowl 18 game in Tampa, Florida, was broadcast by CBS, and it ran Apple Computer's iconic 1984 advertisement for the Macintosh personal computer. Apple placed the Macintosh on sale in the United States 2 days later. On February the 1st, 1984, Medicare came into effect in Australia. From February the 8th to 19th, the 1984 Winter Olympics were held in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, and Sarajevo currently is the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Those Winter Olympics did not suffer from any significant boycott or voluntary or official withdrawal of countries entitled to take part. On February the 13th, Mr. Konstantin Chernenko succeeded the late Yuri Andropov as the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party and as the virtual leader, or at least official leader, of the Soviet Union. One controversial fact was that not only had the late Andropov and his late successor Leonid Brezhnev been severely ill as old men, but so was also Mr. Chernenko. He, for example, when reading out the eulogy to his predecessor, spoke rapidly, swallowed his words, and frequently stopped his speech to wipe his lips and forehead. Chernenko would pass away just 13 months later, in March 1985, to be succeeded by the reform-minded Mikhail Gorbachev, who would be the last Soviet leader. On February the 29th, 1984, after a famous walk in the snowstorm, the Canadian Prime Minister and Liberal Party's leader, Pierre Trudeau, announced that he would finally retire. He would leave office on June the 30th to be succeeded by John Turner. In November 2015, his oldest son, Justin Trudeau, became the current Canadian Prime Minister. Prime Minister Trudeau is quite unpopular, and so is his Liberal Party, and it seems that he will lose the October 2019 Canadian federal parliamentary elections to Andrew Scheer's Conservatives, thus ending probably the latest Trudeau government or Trudeau federal government in Canada. On March the 6th, 1984, a year-long strike action began in the British coal industry. The British coal miners were demanding the prevention of pit closures, it was led by Arthur Scargill of the National Union of Mine Workers against the National Coal Board, a government agency. Opposition to the strike was led by the Conservative government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who wanted to reduce the trade unions' power. The trade unions traditionally had had a close relationship with the centre-left Labour Party. The National Union of Mine Workers was divided over the action, and many mine workers, especially in the Midlands, worked through the dispute. Few major trade unions supported the National Union of Mine Workers, primarily because of the absence of a vote at national level. Violent confrontations between flying pickets and police characterized the year-long strike, which ended in a decisive victory for the Conservative government and allowed the government to close most of Britain's collieries. It was, according to at least one historian, the British history's most bitter industrial dispute. At its height, the strike involved 142,000 mine workers. The number of person days of work lost to the strike was over 26 million, making it the largest since the 1926 general strike. The government strategy designed by Prime Minister Thatcher was threefold: to build up ample coal stocks, to keep as many miners at work as possible, and to use police to break up attacks by pickets on working miners. The critical element was the National Union of Mine Workers' failure to hold a national strike ballot. In September 1984, due to the failure to hold a national ballot, the strike was ruled illegal. It formally ended on March the 3rd, 1985. It was a defining moment in British industrial relations, the National Union of Mine Workers' defeat significantly weakening the trade union movement. It was a major victory for Thatcher and the Conservative Party, which was able to consolidate its economically liberal program. The number of strikes fell sharply in 1985 as a result of the demonstration effect, and trade union power in general diminished. 3 deaths resulted from events related to the strike. On March the 16th, the United States Central Intelligence Agency station chief in Beirut, Lebanon had been torn up by a civil war since 1975. It would only end in 1991. William Francis Buckley was kidnapped by the Islamic Jihad organization and later died in captivity. On March the 22nd, 1984, teachers at the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, United States, were charged with satanic ritual abuse of the school children. The charges were later dropped as completely unfounded. On March the 25th, 1984, Pope John Paul II consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Fatima, Portugal. On April the 1st, 1984, Marvin Gaye, a talented and famous African-American singer, was shot to death following a dispute by his father a day before his 45th birthday. On April the 19th, 1984, Advance Australia Fair was proclaimed as Australia's national anthem and green and gold as the national colours. God Save the King or God Save the Queen had been Australia's official national anthem until that point, but informally still some Australians sing Waltzing Matilda. And indeed, as a comical twist to this story, the Australian women's national football team is called the Matildas. On April the 23rd, 1984, United States researchers announced their discovery of the AIDS virus. On May the 5th, 1984, the Harrys' song Diggiloo Diggiley won the Eurovision Song Contest for Sweden in Luxembourg. On May the 8th, 1984, the Soviet Union announced, citing security concerns as the official reason, or rather excuse, the real reason was its retaliation for the US-led boycott of several Western countries of the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics, that it would boycott the 1984 Los Angeles Summer Olympics. On May the 11th, 1984, transit of Earth from Mars took place. On May the 12th, the Louisiana World Exposition, also known as the 1984 World's Fair, opened. On June the 3rd, 1984, US President Ronald Reagan visited his ancestral home in Ballyporeen, the Republic of Ireland. On June the 4th, Bruce Springsteen released his seventh album, Born in the USA. On June the 5th, the Indian government began Operation Blue Star, the planned attack on the Golden Temple in Amritsar, considered a holy place by the Sikh minority of India. On June the 30th, former Consumer and Corporate Affairs Minister, Justice Minister and Finance Minister John Turner became Canada's 17th Prime Minister, and at the same time the Liberal leader. On July the 1st, Liechtenstein, a tiny alpine state located between Switzerland in the west and Austria in the east, became Europe's last country to grant women the vote. Argentinian footballer Diego Maradona was sold by FC Barcelona, a Spanish football team, to SSC Napoli, an Italian football team, for a world record fee at this date of $10.48 million or 6.9 million British pounds. And of course, it's worth more in today's inflated dollars and pounds. On July the 28th, 1984, the second Summer Olympics to be held in Los Angeles, California, the United States, opened. The first ones were held in 1932. The games would end on August the 12th. They were marked by the boycott of most communist countries, and most notably the Soviet Union. Only two Eastern European communist countries participated in the games: Yugoslavia, which since 1948 had led an officially neutral foreign policy, and Romania, which had, especially since its refusal to participate in Czechoslovakia's occupation in 1968, tried to pursue a somewhat independent course in foreign policy. Interestingly enough, the People's Republic of China participated in these games, and so did Taiwan. On August the 4th, 1984, the African Republic Upper Volta changed its name to Burkina Faso. On August the 11th, 1984, US President Ronald Reagan, during a voice check for a radio broadcast, remarked, "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." Barefoot South African runner Zola Budd, who would later start wearing shoes and would, upon marriage, adopt the name Zola Budd Peterse, controversially granted British citizenship earlier in the year because one of her grandfathers was a native-born British citizen, and Mary Decker of the United States collided in the women's Olympic 3,000 meters final. Decker had to drop out because of a severe leg injury, and during the course of the final lap, Budd faded from the 3rd place to the 7th place. On August the 21st, 1984, the first anniversary of the assassination of former Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., better known as Nino Aquino, at the Manila International Airport. 500,000 people in Manila, the Philippines, demonstrated against the authoritarian regime of President Ferdinand Marcos. He had been in power since December 1965, had won 2 free and fair elections as president or presidential candidate in 1965 and 1969, and since September 1972 had ruled virtually as a dictator. On September the 4th, 1984, the centre-right Progressive Conservative Party of Canada won a landslide victory with about 50% of the vote and about 74% of the seats in the Canadian federal parliamentary elections. On September the 17th, Martin Brian Mulroney, the party's 45-year-old leader, became Canada's 18th Prime Minister. He would serve until June 1993, but the Progressive Conservative Party would be disastrously defeated in the 1993 federal parliamentary elections. It never fully recovered or even significantly recovered its popularity, and its story ended in 2003 or 2004 when it merged with the Canadian Alliance, a more right-wing and populist party, to create the current Conservative Party of Canada. On September the 5th, Western Australia became the last Australian state to abolish capital punishment. On September the 10th, 1984, the American television's quiz show Jeopardy began its syndicated version with present-day host Alex Trebek. On September the 14th, 1984, Peter Willem Botha, a supporter of apartheid, was inaugurated as the first executive state president of South Africa, serving as both the head of state and the head of government. Interestingly, although the apartheid rule was officially abolished by the country's first multiracial democratic elections in South Africa in April 1994, the state president is still both the head of state and the head of government. But the interesting fact is that he or she is both elected by the country's federal parliament and can be dismissed through a vote of confidence by the country's federal parliament. In virtually all other countries where the president is both the head of state and the head of government, a special impeachment procedure is needed to remove the president from office before his or her term of office is scheduled to end. On October the 4th, 1984, Tim McCartney Snape and Greg Mortimer became the first Australians to summit Mount Everest, which is the world's highest mountain. On October the 12th, 1984, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, a terrorist organization, attempted to assassinate the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the British cabinet in the Brighton Hotel bombing in southern England. On October the 19th, 1984, Polish secret police kidnapped Mr. Jerzy Popiełuszko, a Catholic priest who supported the Solidarity movement and had begun once per month to preach a socially critical and politically critical sermon called the so-called Sermon to the Fatherland. His dead body was found in a reservoir on October the 30th. On October the 23rd, 1984, the world learned from moving BBC News television reports presented by Michael Burke of the famine in Ethiopia, a large country in Eastern Africa, or in the Horn of Africa, almost, where thousands of people had already died of starvation due to a famine, and as many as 10 million more lives were at risk. On October the 25th, 1984, the European Economic Community, the predecessor of today's European Union, made 1.8 million British pounds available to help combat the famine in Ethiopia. On October the 31st, the female Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her 2 Sikh security guards in New Delhi, India's capital. Anti-Sikh riots broke out, leaving 10,000 to 20,000 Sikhs dead in Delhi and surrounding areas with majority populations of Hindus. Mrs. Gandhi's son, Rajiv Gandhi, became the Indian Prime Minister. Tragically, he would too be assassinated in the spring of 1991. On October the 31st, Galilei was forgiven by the Vatican for work on the Earth orbit 368 years after being condemned. On November the 4th, the Sandinista Front, a left-wing party, won the Nicaraguan general elections, paving the way for Daniel Ortega to become the country's president. Nicaragua is a country in Central America. On November the 6th, Ronald Reagan was comfortably re-elected as US president with about 59% of the popular vote, winning 49 states out of 50. Only one previous presidential candidate had won as many states, fellow Republican President Richard Nixon in 1972. Despite Reagan's victory, the Democrats retained their majority in the US House of Representatives. The Republicans held the Senate, and the Democrats retained the control of most US governorships. On November the 14th, 1984, Zamboanga City Mayor Cesar Climaco, in the Mindanao region of southern Philippines, a prominent critic of the autocratic or authoritarian Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, was assassinated in his home city. In December 1984, a peace agreement between Kenya and Somalia was signed in the Egyptian capital, Cairo. With this agreement, in which Somalia officially renounced its historical territorial claims, relations between the two countries began to improve. On December the 3rd, 1984, occurred the Bhopal disaster in Madhya Pradesh, India. A methyl isocyanate leak from a Union Carbide pesticide plant killed over 8,000 people outright and injured over 500,000. With more later dying from their injuries, the death toll reached 23,000 plus people. Quite many people also were visually impaired or blinded, although they survived. On December the 10th, 1984, Cisco Systems was founded. On December the 19th, 1984, the People's Republic of China and Britain signed the Chinese-British Joint Declaration on the Future of Hong Kong. Britain would peacefully hand over the colony to China on July the 1st, 1997. On December the 28th, 1984, a Soviet cruise missile plunged into Lake Inarinjärvi in the Finnish Lapland. Finnish authorities announced the fact in public on January the 3rd, 1985.